often begin the story of the Dark Ages with a door slamming shut, a symbolic end to the grandeur of Rome. What follows, we're told, is a time of darkness, roads falling to ruin, libraries burning to ash, and the light of knowledge extinguished by war, plague, and superstition. In our collective imagination, the Dark Ages are a pit of regression, a thousand-year night from which Europe would not awaken until the Renaissance. The popular images are haunting. Monks hunched over crumbling scrolls in candlelit stone chambers, dirt roads lined with ragged beggars, cities decaying into ruin with wolves prowling their empty streets. And looming above it all, the constant threat of death, whether by sword, sickness, or the fiery hand of divine judgment. It is a vision drenched in suffering and silence, where fear replaces curiosity and ignorance is inherited as survival. But what if we've misunderstood this darkness? What if, in the very heart of that so-called night, there were places where the flame of civilization continued to flicker and even burn brightly? Places where scholars debated astronomy, where surgeons stitched wounds with precision, where poets crafted verse in multiple tongues, and where cities hummed with trade, architecture, and philosophy. What if we've been so focused on the ruins of Rome that we failed to see the rise of something new, something resilient, something radiant? Because scattered across continents, sometimes hidden behind deserts or perched upon forgotten trade routes, stood cities that refused to be buried by the weight of collapse. These were not accidental survivors, they were deliberate, determined centers of human endeavor, cities that read the winds of history and chose to build anyway. Some of them preserved the wisdom of the ancient world, others created their own. Many connected civilizations in ways we rarely acknowledge, all of them in their own way defied the darkness. In this episode, we'll take you on a journey through these forgotten cities, some you may have heard of but never truly understood. Others will likely surprise you. They are not just footnotes in history books. They are proof that even in the bleakest of times, humanity does not surrender easily, that even in the longest night, there are those who tend to the fire. So the question is no longer were the Dark Ages really dark, it's where was the light hiding and who protected it for us. Let's begin. When the Western Roman Empire crumbled under the weight of invasion, corruption, and economic collapse, many assumed the Roman story was over. But far to the east, beyond the smoldering remnants of Western Europe, the empire still breathed, though differently. Its heartbeat was no longer in Rome, but in a city straddling two worlds, Constantinople. Founded by Emperor Constantine in 330 CE and christened Nova Roma, it would come to bear his name and far outlive its western sibling. By the early Middle Ages, while cities in Gaul and Britannia faded into obscurity, Constantinople remained a thriving metropolis, cosmopolitan, fortified, and magnificently adorned with domes, mosaics, and palatial halls. To many in the Latin West, the city was an enigma. Was it Roman? Was it Greek? Was it something entirely different? It was all of these and more. Surrounded by the mighty Theodosian walls, triple-layered defenses that would repel siege after siege, Constantinople stood not just as a military stronghold, but as a cultural sanctuary. While knowledge flickered elsewhere, this city kept the embers burning. Its libraries held precious scrolls of Plato, Aristotle, Galen, and Euclid. Its bureaucrats wrote and preserved laws in Greek and Latin. Its artisans refined architectural marvels that had no parallel for centuries, none more iconic than Hagia Sophia, a dome that seemed to float above the earth, whispering heaven down to those below. Inside this metropolis, East met West and religion merged with state. Emperors sat on golden thrones, seeing themselves not merely as kings, but as God's chosen stewards. The Orthodox Church flourished in its own right, evolving differently from the Latin tradition. Chanting echoed through cavernous basilicas, processions glittered with incense and iconography. This was not the dimness of medieval ignorance, it was a different kind of light, one that the West, in its disrepair, struggled to recognize. But Constantinople was not untouched by fear. Though it shone brightly, it was also under constant threat. From Slavic tribes, Arab navies, and even Latin crusaders who would one day betray it, the city stood like a candle in the wind. It was this tension of brilliance standing against the dark that made it a reluctant beacon, not triumphant, not invincible, but enduring. Even in its contradictions, Constantinople dared to be luminous when the rest of Europe seemed wrapped in shadow. It translated ancient texts, it debated theology with an obsessive precision. It held markets where Persian silks touched Norse furs. It became, without ever asking for the title, the most vital city in Christendom. When we talk about forgotten cities that defied the darkness, we must begin here, not because Constantinople was obscure, but because modern minds too easily relegate it to the past without grasping what it preserved for us. Without Constantinople, there would be no Renaissance. Without its stubborn refusal to collapse, much of the ancient world would have been lost to time. And so, while Europe slumbered through feudalism and famine, Constantinople kept watch, alone, proud, and quietly heroic. While much of Christian Europe was still cloaked in feudal dust and lit only by the flickering flame of Latin scrolls hidden in monasteries, far to the south, across the Pyrenees and into the sun-drenched land of Al-Andalus, a different kind of light was shining. Cordoba, to the average medieval European, the name might have sounded foreign, perhaps even heretical. But in truth, Cordoba was once the most advanced city in all of Europe, and arguably the world. In the 10th century, under the reign of Caliph Abd al-Rahman II, Cordoba wasn't just a city, it was a civilization within walls. Home to nearly 500,000 people, while London and Paris barely scraped a tenth of that, Cordoba was paved with stone streets, lit with oil lamps, and flowing with water through aqueducts and public baths. While many European peasants still lived in wooden huts without windows here, scholars debated astronomy under domed ceilings, and poets recited verses beside fountains fed by underground channels. But what made Cordoba miraculous wasn't just its scale, it was its soul. The city was a melting pot of minds. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side, sometimes uneasily, yes, but often in vibrant, if fragile, cooperation. In an age when the church in Rome was suspicious of inquiry and deviation, Cordoba embraced intellectual plurality. The great library of Cordoba was said to house over 400,000 manuscripts, dwarfing anything in Latin Christendom. Here, philosophy was not feared but cultivated. Thinkers like Averroes, Ibn Rushd dared to resurrect Aristotle when Europe had long buried him. Maimonides, the Jewish philosopher-physician, wrote his greatest works in Arabic, contributing to medicine and law for generations to come. Mathematics, chemistry, anatomy, geography, they were not separated by walls of religion, but stitched together under the idea that knowledge was divine. And while many in northern Europe saw disease as punishment from heaven, Cordoba's doctors were performing cataract surgeries, writing medical encyclopedias, and refining surgical tools. The architecture reflected this grandeur. The Mezquita of Cordoba, with its forest of red and white striped arches, stood not just as a house of worship, but as a temple to human ingenuity. Every column whispered, "We have not forgotten the ancients, we are speaking with them still." But Cordoba, like all lights in a world that mistrusts fire, could not burn forever. By the 11th century, political fractures and internal strife began to tear at the fabric of Al-Andalus. The Christian Reconquista crept ever southward. The Golden Age faded, not because Cordoba was defeated in war, but because it lost the will to protect its own brilliance. Scholars were exiled, libraries burned, and tolerance became a memory. Still, for a brief, extraordinary window in time, Cordoba defied the idea that the Dark Ages were universally dark. It was a contradiction to the narrative. A flare of elegance and intellect, a reminder that even in medieval times humans could dream, not of heaven alone, but of a world where beauty, logic, and faith walked hand in hand. To forget Cordoba is to forget that not all of history's light comes from the West. In the minds of many, the medieval world is a map where light fades the farther you move from Rome. But that's because the map we inherited was drawn by hands that never ventured far enough east. Because had they looked beyond Byzantium, across the great deserts and Fertile Crescent, they would have seen a city that didn't just resist the darkness, it redefined what light could mean. Baghdad, founded in 762 by Caliph al-Mansur, it was no accident of trade or tribal power. Baghdad was designed meticulously, built as a round city, a circle of symmetry and science, at its heart. The House of Wisdom, or Beit al-Hikmah, not just a library but a civilizational engine. Imagine this, while Viking raiders sacked monasteries in the north, in Baghdad, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian, Hindu, and even Chinese scholars sat at the same tables, translating texts from Greek, Sanskrit, Syriac, and Persian into Arabic. They weren't just preserving knowledge, they were transforming it. Names that medieval Europe wouldn't recognize until centuries later were already celebrities here. Al-Khwarizmi, the father of algebra. Ibn Sina Avicenna, whose canon of medicine would be taught in European universities for 500 years. Alhazen, who figured out the fundamentals of optics and light centuries before Newton. Al-Razi, who differentiated smallpox from measles and pioneered the use of alcohol in medicine. And it wasn't just science. Baghdad was the cultural heartbeat of a civilization that embraced the unknown. Philosophy, poetry, music, metaphysics, everything was fair game. People debated Aristotle in coffee houses and recited verses from Rumi and Hafez under moonlit domes. Here, questions were not punishable, they were sacred. But perhaps the most astonishing thing, this explosion of learning and creativity happened at a time when most of Europe had forgotten how to build stone bridges. Baghdad had hospitals, postal systems, night patrols, sanitation plans, and even public hospitals that treated rich and poor alike. It was not just a city of gold and domes, it was a mindset, a radical belief that the universe could be known, that God would not be offended by inquiry, and that truth had no nationality. And yet, like all golden ages, it stood vulnerable to the very forces it defied. In 1258, the Mongols arrived. Hulagu Khan's army laid siege, and after weeks of horror, Baghdad fell. The Tigris ran black with ink and red with blood. The House of Wisdom, centuries of human thought, was reduced to soggy parchment and silence. It is said that so many books were thrown into the river that the water ran dark for days. But what Baghdad left behind was more than architecture or libraries. It left a blueprint. It proved that curiosity could build empires, that pluralism wasn't weakness, it was strength. That the so-called Dark Ages were not dark everywhere, only in the places where light was feared. While Western Europe stumbled through fragmented kingdoms and feudal uncertainty, there stood one city, magnificent and defiant, that refused to collapse into the chaos. A city that called itself Nova Roma, the New Rome, but history would remember it by another name, Constantinople. Perched on the edge of two continents, Constantinople wasn't just a city, it was a statement. A shimmering fortress of marble, gold, and relentless willpower that declared, Rome is not dead. Founded by Emperor Constantine in 330 AD, the city grew into the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire, an empire that was Roman in law, Greek in culture, Christian in soul, and military in muscle. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476, Constantinople did not mourn, it fortified. By the early Middle Ages, while most of Europe's roads fell to ruin and aqueducts dried to dust, Constantinople still had running water, street lighting, and a navy that could scorch the sea. Let that sink in. In an age where most cities feared fire and famine, Constantinople wielded Greek fire, a terrifying weapon that could ignite even on water. Its formula remains lost to this day, a well-guarded secret that turned the city into an unbreakable bastion. When invaders saw it, they didn't just retreat, they ran screaming. But military might wasn't the city's only brilliance. This was a place where law lived on. The Corpus Juris Civilis, or Justinian Code, born in Constantinople in the 6th century, became the backbone of modern European law. That's right, many of the laws that govern the West today trace their lineage not to medieval kings, but to the codices drafted beneath the golden mosaics of Hagia Sophia. And oh, Hagia Sophia, step inside and your breath halts. This was not a church, it was a cosmic encounter. Built in just 5 years, unbelievable for the time, it held the world's largest dome for nearly 1,000 years. It was a statement of power, beauty, and divine ambition that dwarfed the crude wooden chapels of the West. In Constantinople, scholars preserved not just Greek classics, but mathematics, astronomy, medicine. It was in Byzantine hands that the flame of Homer, Plato, and Euclid endured. Without them, the Renaissance may never have happened. But perhaps the most ironic truth, to many in medieval Europe, Constantinople wasn't a symbol of salvation, it was a threat. Its Orthodox faith clashed with the Latin West. Crusaders who were supposed to protect Christianity sacked Constantinople in 1204, looting its sacred relics and desecrating its churches. The city survived, but it never truly recovered, and yet it held. Through wars, betrayals, earthquakes, sieges, it held, until 1453. When Mame the Conqueror breached its massive Theodosian walls after a 53-day siege. The fall of Constantinople wasn't just the end of the Byzantine Empire, it was the end of the ancient world. But Constantinople never truly died. Its laws, its wisdom, its art flowed westward, carried by refugees and exiled scholars. And in doing so, it sparked the Renaissance, a strange twist of fate where the city's fall became Europe's rebirth. In a time called dark, Constantinople was the star that refused to go out. It didn't just defy the Dark Ages. It embarrassed them. When you think of the Middle Ages, what images come to mind? Likely not the rhythmic clapping of sails along an East African coast, not the sound of merchants bargaining in a symphony of Swahili, Arabic, Persian, and Somali. And certainly not the glint of Chinese porcelain beside Persian rugs in open-air markets. But that unexpectedly is Mogadishu. Yes, Mogadishu. Long before it became synonymous with modern headlines of conflict and instability, Mogadishu was a city of refinement and riches, a place so prosperous it earned the nickname. The City of Gold, founded as early as the 10th century, and perhaps earlier, Mogadishu wasn't just surviving during the so-called Dark Ages, it was thriving. Its strategic location along the Indian Ocean made it a central hub in the global trade routes of the medieval world. Dhows filled with spices from India, silk from China, and glass from the Middle East docked daily. their hulls swelling with ivory, gold, and textiles from the African interior in return. But Mogadishu was not simply a middleman, it was a maker of luxury. The city produced its own high-quality fabrics, particularly a woven cloth so prized in Egypt and elsewhere that it became a status symbol among Muslim elites. Its coins, minted in Arabic script, were found as far as the Persian Gulf, evidence of its influence stretching far beyond the African coastline. Culturally, Mogadishu was a melting pot centuries before the term existed. Islam flourished here, yes, but it did so beside indigenous African traditions, maritime customs, and Persian architectural influences. Its ruling elite were often polyglot, educated, and engaged in diplomatic correspondence with distant powers. Some even wrote to the Mamluk sultans of Egypt or received Chinese envoys from the fleets of Zheng He. And here's something that defies every tired medieval stereotype. Mogadishu had diplomatic relations with China. In the 15th century, Admiral Zheng He's vast treasure fleet, one of the largest maritime forces the world had ever seen, anchored near the East African coast. Mogadishu received them with ceremony and sophistication. Gifts were exchanged, so were technologies, so were stories. Can you imagine that? While much of Europe was still reeling from the Black Death and political fragmentation, an East African city was engaging with the largest naval expedition in world history, without fear, without inferiority, just trade, dialogue, and grace. Mogadishu, like many medieval Islamic cities, kept records, chronicles, architectural planning, maritime logs, poetry. These weren't primitive settlements, they were cosmopolitan engines of diplomacy, culture, and enterprise. But why don't we hear about it? Because the medieval story we inherit is told through a narrow lens, one centered on Western Europe's decline, not the global vibrancy that continued elsewhere. And in this silence, the brilliance of Mogadishu was left to the dust. Yet for centuries, it lit up the East African coast like a jewel, a reminder that the Middle Ages were never truly global darkness. They were, in many places, golden. To most people, Venice is the city of romance, gondolas gliding down canals, masked balls, soft echoes of Vivaldi in the air. But behind the postcards and poetry lies something much fiercer. In the middle of what we call the Dark Ages, Venice wasn't a helpless city drifting with the tide, it was a republic with iron ambition. Rising from the marshes of a lagoon, Venice was born of necessity. As the Western Roman Empire collapsed and waves of invaders swept across northern Italy, refugees fled to the swampy islands offshore, not for luxury, but for survival. They built on water because the water protected them. No king could gallop an army through mudflats and shifting tides, but what began as refuge soon turned into reinvention. Unlike the feudal kingdoms around it, Venice didn't fall into the medieval mold. It had no crowned monarch, no hereditary lords clashing for castles. Instead, it evolved into a merchant republic, ruled by a doge, an elected leader, and by councils formed from powerful merchant families. Not a democracy in the modern sense, but a system with checks, balances, and fiercely protected civic identity. And it worked. While many parts of Europe languished under feudal strife, Venice was building ships, not just for trade, but for empire. Its shipyards, the Arsenale di Venezia, became the industrial marvel of the medieval world. At their peak, they could build a fully functional warship in a single day. This wasn't just craftsmanship, it was early mass production. Assembly lines, naval innovation. In the 12th century, from these docks, Venice launched itself into the Mediterranean. It didn't conquer by sword alone, it conquered with trade, silk from Byzantium, spices from the East. Salt, glass, wool, and slaves. Venice was a middleman, but a powerful one, shaping supply chains, dictating prices, even stirring wars when it suited their merchants. But Venice wasn't just ruthless, it was brilliantly adaptable. When the First Crusade ended with a Latin kingdom in Jerusalem, it was Venetian ships that ferried the Crusaders. When Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, teetered in the Fourth Crusade, it was the Venetians, led by blind but cunning Doge Enrico Dandolo, who turned the campaign into a military and economic coup, looting the city and seizing immense treasures for cent. Mark's Basilica, Venice played the East and the West, Islam and Christianity, emperors and sultans, all for its own gain, and in doing so it thrived while others crumbled. But here's what truly sets Venice apart. Its survival through independence. While so many cities bowed to kings, popes, or emperors, Venice remained sovereign for over 1,000 years. It outlasted Charlemagne, outlasted the Crusades, outlasted the Black Death. Its republic only fell when Napoleon marched in with artillery. Venice was proof that in the so-called Dark Ages, liberty and commerce could build something enduring, not just in theory, but in stone, marble, and water. So no, the Dark Ages were not all chains and castles. Sometimes they were sails and signatures. While Europe struggled to preserve scraps of Roman learning, a very different story was unfolding just beyond the Mediterranean, in the city of Fez, Morocco. Founded in the 8th century, Fez was not a military fortress or a royal playground, it was a city built around knowledge. At its heart stood Al-Qarawiyyin, a mosque and university founded in 859 CE by a woman named Fatima al-Fihri. Yes, a woman, in a world where many believed women should be silent and veiled from both power and learning. Fatima's legacy stood in defiance. She didn't build a shrine. She built a university that still operates today, recognized by UNESCO as the oldest existing and continually operating educational institution in the world. But Fez was more than just a single university. It was a living archive of scholarship. Its libraries brimmed with works in Arabic, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Subjects like astronomy, philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and law weren't tucked away as curiosities. They were discussed, debated, and refined. Translation centers turned Greek classics into Arabic, preserving them during a time when Christian Europe often labeled them pagan and dangerous. And Fez didn't hoard this knowledge, it exported it. Muslim Spain, Al-Andalus, became the bridge through which Arabic scientific and philosophical advancements re-entered Europe, laying foundations for the eventual Renaissance. In other words, without Fez and cities like it, the so-called rediscovery of Aristotle or algebra in Europe might never have happened. But let's be clear, Fez wasn't just a city of books, it was alive. Its Medina, a labyrinth of narrow streets and colorful stalls, was a bustling economic hub. Skilled artisans produced leather, ceramics, textiles, and metalwork. Merchants traded spices, gold, and ideas. Mosques and fountains lined the quarters, each one a testament to how spiritual life was woven into daily routine, not in opposition to intellect but alongside it. And unlike the strict class divisions in many European cities, Fez was diverse and layered. Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived and worked in proximity. Scholars from Baghdad sat next to those from Timbuktu. Ideas moved faster than empires. In the myth of the Dark Ages, Africa is often a blank space, ignored or reduced to the margins. But Fez proves that while parts of Europe forgot how to dream, other civilizations were writing volumes of possibility in ink and stone. So the next time someone tells you the Middle Ages were about ignorance and isolation, remember, there were cities like Fez where the mind was sharper than the sword, and where a woman built a future for generations of thinkers yet to come. To call medieval Baghdad just a city would be like calling Rome a town or Constantinople a village. No, Baghdad was a cosmos unto itself. Founded in 762 CE by the Abbasid Caliph Al-Mansur, it was envisioned from the beginning as a metropolis of brilliance, and for several centuries, it truly was the most advanced city on the planet. While Europe was still emerging from the rubble of Rome, Baghdad was already illuminating the known world. At its core stood Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. Forget any notion of a library filled with dusty scrolls. This was a scientific institute, a translation hub, and a research academy rolled into one. Scholars from every religion and ethnicity worked side by side here. Muslims, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, even Indian and Chinese visitors contributed to an intellectual explosion rarely matched in history. They translated Greek philosophical texts, preserved Persian medicine, adapted Indian mathematics, and developed original ideas in astronomy, optics, algebra, chemistry, and more. Al-Khwarizmi, the father of algebra, worked here. So did Al-Kindi, the first Arab philosopher, and Al-Razi, the pioneering physician who wrote about measles and smallpox centuries before Europe understood germs. But this wasn't an ivory tower separated from reality. Baghdad had hospitals with medical licensing exams, public observatories, and bookstores on every corner. Its markets buzzed not just with silk and spices, but with manuscripts and more manuscripts, copies of Aristotle, Euclid, Galen, as well as original poetry, political theory, and theological debates. The city itself was designed like a mandala, with massive round walls, a symbol of perfection, and at its center, the caliph's golden palace, surrounded by gardens, fountains, and bustling courtyards. This was a city that respected thinkers. Caliphs rewarded scholars with gold, patronage, and influence. Philosophers dined with governors, and poets could sway the mood of a court. Imagine a world where ideas were currency. That was Baghdad. But perhaps what made Baghdad most extraordinary was its pluralism. It was a meeting point of East and West, where languages coexisted, and you were more likely to be judged by your intellect than your background. Sadly, much of this light was extinguished in 1258 when the Mongols sacked the city. Legend says the Tigris River ran black with ink from drowned books and red with the blood of scholars. But even in destruction, Baghdad's legacy endured. The knowledge preserved and generated there laid intellectual foundations for both the Islamic Golden Age and the later European Renaissance. In short, Baghdad was not just a beacon in the Dark Ages, it was the sun itself. While many medieval minds were told to stay silent, Baghdad whispered, shouted, and sang, think, learn, question, build, so remember. Not all who lived in the Dark Ages were in the dark. Some lit fires that still burn today. To the average person today, Timbuktu sounds like a metaphor, a faraway mythical land on the edge of the world, a punchline for distance. But what if I told you Timbuktu was once closer to the center of the world's intellectual gravity than most European capitals? What if I told you this city, rising from the golden sands of Mali, once held hundreds of thousands of handwritten books and was a sanctuary for scholars when much of the world was at war? Founded as a seasonal settlement around the 12th century, Timbuktu soon evolved into a flourishing trade hub. Positioned strategically near the Niger River and along trans-Saharan trade routes, it became a marketplace for salt, gold, ivory, and slaves. But more than commodities, Timbuktu became known for a rarer treasure, knowledge. At its intellectual peak during the 14th to 16th centuries, especially under the Mali and Songhai empires, Timbuktu housed multiple universities, including the famed Sankore University, where students came not just from West Africa but from across the Islamic world. And these were no mere classrooms with scrolls. These were fully fledged academic institutions with structured degrees, libraries, and peer-reviewed scholarship. Imagine dusty caravans of camels arriving not with incense or silk, but with parchment, ink, and leather-bound texts. Imagine families passing down not gold but books as heirlooms, as tools, as legacy. The subjects, mathematics, astronomy, jurisprudence, medicine, poetry, botany, theology, history, logic, even gender relations. Scholars in Timbuktu wrote treatises on the rights of women, the ethics of war, the use of anesthesia in surgery, ideas often centuries ahead of their European counterparts. And these weren't just Arabic copies of foreign works. Many were original writings in local dialects, often annotated, debated, and personalized. In fact, some families amassed private libraries with over 10,000 manuscripts, guarded like sacred relics through generations. What makes Timbuktu's story even more extraordinary is how it survived obscurity and erasure. During French colonialism, it was dismissed as primitive. During extremist occupation in 2012, militants tried to destroy its libraries. And yet the people of Timbuktu risked their lives to hide manuscripts in rice sacks, bury them beneath homes, and smuggle them across rivers, not for fame, but for the preservation of truth. So when you hear the word Timbuktu, don't imagine a forgotten desert outpost. Imagine a fortress of knowledge, surrounded by dunes, humming with the voices of scholars, where wisdom outweighed wealth, and where the light of human curiosity burned despite every storm. Timbuktu did not defy the darkness with walls or armies. It did so with words.